Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to St. Paul's on the Green. My name is David Westmoreland. I'm a parishioner here. I've been a member for 20 plus years. Um, I did my master's thesis when I was at Cornell on the preservation of this burying ground. And so I've learned a bit about it over the years, and I know lots of random facts, and I'll try to share some of those today. Uh, if you have questions, just feel free to pipe up. A little bit about the history of St. Paul's in Norwalk. Really, we'll start with the founding of Norwalk when white people came. I won't go back. I can go back further than that, but that's where we'll start today because of context for the burying ground. Um, the land for Norwalk on both sides of the river was purchased in quotes by two different English settlers from eastern Connecticut in 1641 from the indigenous peoples who lived here. Norwalk wasn't actually colonized or settled until 1651, 10 years later. And those settlers were all Puritans from England. And they, um, they brought with them what we now know as the Congregational Church. Over time, towns like Norwalk, they wanted to grow and build, and so some of the communities accepted other religions and faith into their communities and encouraged them because they were competing with other towns to grow. And the Puritans here allowed the Anglican Church from England, people who profess that faith, to come and settle here as well. And they brought their church and they established a church here. Before St. Paul's was actually founded, there was a circuit rider by the name of Henry Kaner, and he was an Anglican priest, and he lived in Fairfield, but he rode a circuit between Fairfield and Greenwich, and he stopped and gave communion to practicing Anglicans in each community. Around 1733, there were over 100 professors of the Anglican faith in Norwalk, and they got together and petitioned the Church of England to have a priest and establish a church. And that's how St. Paul's was founded. The first building was built in 1737, and that was the official opening of the church. It was a very small building, but it was located on this site. That building was later moved and incorporated when they built a rectory, a place for the priests to live over here. It was actually picked up and moved and made part of that, which then was subsequently burned by the British, but that's another story we'll get to. So they built a bigger church, something that looked really actually like a church. And that building subsequently was burned by the British in 1779. And then it was rebuilt in 1785 exactly like it was. And St. Paul's has the distinction of being the first. There were no bishops of the Anglican Church in America. And the first bishop consecrated, Samuel Seabury, was from Connecticut. And so he came in July of 1785, and he consecrated the rebuilt church. And it was the first consecrated church in the United States of America ever by a bishop, another distinction. That church was replaced in 1840 by a Carpenter Gothic style church building, very, very similar to the Episcopal church that survives in Southport, Connecticut. So if you're ever over there, that's pretty much almost exactly the church. That church wasn't kept up. The steeple was struck by lightning. The priest, somebody left a bunch of money in the late 1800s. The priest in the early 1900s really wanted to emphasize the Anglo-Catholic tradition and have the liturgy, and that church building at the time didn't have the chancel that we have today that you need to have all the things, bells and whistles, I hate to call it that, but all the stuff that goes on in our service today. And subsequently they built this Gothic stone church that is modeled after I think it's a 12th century English parish church. One of the unique features of St. Paul's, of pretty much all Episcopal churches in Connecticut, is I believe we're the only one that has a burying ground that surrounds the church, exactly like you'll find when you go to England. You'll walk through the churchyard to the front door. Some people find this off-putting, some people don't. But it is very much reminiscent of an English parish church. The weather vane that was on the church that we took down when we renovated, which is actually on display in the Chitham Howe House, the old rectory, which we hope to either replicate or fix that one and put it back. That has been on every church building since the second building. It was rescued from the ashes of the building that was burned by the British, and we hope to get it repaired, or like I said, probably a replica put back one of these days. The first burial recorded at St. Paul's in the churchyard was in 1739, just 2 years after the church opened and was built. The oldest surviving stone in the churchyard dates from 1740, just a year later, which is over right along one of the slates right along the wall over there. Let's see, the stone. First burial. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So anyway, so this is a burying ground, not a cemetery, technically. Burying grounds and graveyards they're spaces where you bury the dead, but they're not necessarily organized. And, it's just you find a spot and you bury somebody, and then, his brother dies and you bury them next to that. And it's kind of random. So you don't really see a lot of long straight rows. A cemetery is a planned burying ground that has a plot layout, usually has an organization that either maintains it as a not-for-profit or as a for-profit institution. But that's kind of the main, it's a subtle but main difference. The burying ground over at Mill Hill on the south side of the green, that's a burying ground. It's random. Riverside Cemetery, that's a cemetery. Pine Island Cemetery, which is one of the oldest cemeteries in Norwalk, started out as a burying ground, but it was organized into plots and later had a plot planned, and so we call it Pine Island Cemetery. Same thing with East Avenue. The East Avenue Cemetery is the oldest cemetery in Norwalk. The one you drive around, it's kind of built up down at the bottom of East Avenue. That started out as a burying ground. This St. Paul's would be the third oldest burying ground in Norwalk. So East Avenue being the first one, Pine Island was established the second, primarily for use by South Norwalk since it was over the river. That was in 1713, and this one established in 1737. Mill Hill was 1753. So very, very old. Now I'll just talk a little bit about burying grounds. The Puritan influence was really, really heavy in New England, and you see their influence on things like tombstone designs and many other aspects of daily life back in that period, regardless of your faith. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. In fact, actually, why don't we walk right over here to this corner. I'm going to skip around a little bit. I haven't done this in a few years, so I'm a little jumpy.
David, do you know which is the most recent burial that's occurred in this burial ground?
The most recent body burial was in the early 2000s, and it was actually in a tomb in the back, a family tomb, which I'll talk a little bit about more. If you can actually come around this side, because I want you to see the fronts of the cemetery, of the tombstones. So whenever you see a slate tombstone, this gray color, this is slate. This is very prevalent in New England, and they're really great because they held up pretty well, as you can see. These are always the oldest in a cemetery, always, always, always. But you can see by the design, it has a skull with wings. I mean, not a very happy, friendly, I want to remember kind of thought. And this really reflects the Puritans' attitudes towards death. And they use cemeteries as teaching devices. They didn't really keep them up. They had scary designs on the tombstones. Um, and even look at the wording. Here lies buried the body of, or here lies the mortal remains. You see that. There's nothing about, I miss this person in memory of. It's just, this is the remains of this person. Um, and over time, and you have to remember, life was very, very hard. I mean, these people moved over here with basically nothing and had to build their own homes and, didn't have really access to supplies. And graves were actually rarely marked in the colonial period. It's estimated that only 1 in 4 graves ever actually got a tombstone. So oftentimes you'll just find a stone in the ground. And so if you ever see a stone buried in the ground, in a burying ground, it usually marks somebody's grave. So you don't ever move a rough stone because that's probably somebody's burying ground. You can see over at Mill Hill, there's literally rows and rows of stones. But we estimate there's probably about 300 to 400 colonial period graves in this cemetery that aren't even marked. Because they didn't get their stones, and that doesn't even account for ones that were, there were also many tombstones that were destroyed over the years. As I've alluded to earlier, there was a battle that took place here. The British and German mercenary soldiers burnt the town to the ground. They desecrated tombstones. They burnt their own church, the Church of England, to the ground along with everything else in Norwalk. But as life got a little easier, and the settlers settled in, you see that their attitudes towards death softened and they started to have time to remember and miss people. And one of the changes you see is that this is reflected in tombstone design, but the skull becomes an angel. This still says, here lies buried the body of, but you'll see in a few other places it'll move to, in memory of this person and that sort of thing. But it really is stark. And on every graveyard you go to in New England, you'll see 3 designs: the skull with wings, the angel with wings, and then there's another one I'll show you later, which is the end period, which is an urn with a willow tree. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Before we move on, I just want to point out these slate graves are from the Isaacs family, and this is Ralph Isaacs, and this is actually his footstone. The tombstones, the bodies were always buried facing east, facing the rising sun, kind of symbolizing the resurrection to come. And they were marked at the head by a tombstone and then a smaller stone called a footstone. So you see these are actually footstones. These just mark the bottom of the grave. Usually it just has the person's initials on it. The other thing that's interesting, of what you're probably not used to, is that the inscription is facing out instead of facing above it, above where the body was buried. And that's just what they did. I mean, I guess they didn't really want people necessarily to walk across the body or whatever, but that changed over time as fashions and design changed, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But Ralph is one of my favorite stories. We lost somewhere probably in the Revolution. He died before the Revolution. His stone was, his tombstone, big stone, was destroyed. And this stone should go over there, but it was fallen, and we decided to just put it here where to mark the head of his grave because the tree was really in the way. To put that back. But Ralph is one of my favorite people in the cemetery. He's considered one of the 4 founders of St. Paul's. Ralph and 3 other men put up the money that the Church of England required to establish a church and send a priest over. But what's interesting about Ralph is that Ralph was a Jewish merchant from New York City, and he moved out here to establish a business and make a living. And there weren't a lot of Jews here, so he wanted to get married and start a family, and he had his choice of marrying a Puritan woman or an Anglican woman. And basically the Anglicans were way more fun. The Puritans were seriously not fun at all. So he married a woman named Mary Rumsey, and he converted and became a pillar of the church. But I love the fact that our church represented diverse faith really from the very beginning. And it's a very cool descendants. One of his eighth great grandson is a retired Norwalk fireman and one of my good friends here in Norwalk at Isaacs. And Isaac Street over by where Garden Cinema used to be, that's named after their family. So moving on over here, there's a couple more colonial ones I want to show you.
So has the Puritans, has that evolved into some current religion?
Yeah, it's the Congregational Church.
It is a common.
Yeah, and
Now quite progressive.
it's generally quite progressive. They aren't all quite progressive, but they're generally quite progressive. I'll just point out this one quickly because this is one of my favorites. This is Elizabeth, the wife of Matthew Reed, and Matthew Reed. This is his tombstone. Yeah. What's really interesting about these two tombstones is that you have this colonial period design, but on a white marble tombstone. And white marble really wasn't used until the mid 1800s. So he was very fashionable, and he died in 1797 and had these made as something different. So you really never see these colonial period designs on a white marble tombstone. Matthew Reed, he served in the American Revolution. He was a patriot, but he was also a clockmaker. And if you visit the Norwalk Historical Society Museum over next to City Hall, when you go in, there's a stairway with a big landing, and there's three tall case clocks, and the clock farthest to the left is a clock that he built. It was the 35th clock he made, and it's signed at the top. It's quite clear, and you can see it. It's very, very cool. But back to the idea that tombstones were used, graveyards were used as teaching devices by the Puritans. This is unfortunately the broken tombstone of Mercy Hanford. And I was actually going to repair this today, but I can't do it in the rain. I have to have good weather. I just got some epoxy to put it back together. But you can see it has the skull with wings, and the other side of her footstone has what do you call these flowers? No, the cylindrical one, the white ones. You know what I'm talking about? Calla lilies. It has calla lilies on it. So Mercy Hanford was 20 years old when she died, and she was very young. So the calla lilies symbolize a young person dying. And so there's all kinds of symbolism built into all these things. But what I can't show you, which is at the bottom part of the tombstone, while it has the typical "here lies the remains of," there's a poem that was also frequently used on tombstones. It really illustrates this whole idea of you know, you need to behave and be a good person. But the poem goes something like, "Youths, look at me while you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, you soon will be. Prepare for death and follow me." So, you know, that's pretty grim, and I can't imagine putting that on, you know, one of my. It is, and I wouldn't want to put that on anybody in my family's tombstones. It's just depressing. But I just wanted to. I like to show that because it really emphasizes that whole point. Let's see, we'll go, I should have pointed back. There's two white marble tombstones right across from Ralph Isaacs, Paul and Sarah Taylor. And Paul and Sarah Taylor, Paul was, he was born here. He was probably third generation, but his family came from England. He was loyal to the king, very strong, and he didn't participate in the revolution. He had several children, and his son Lewis Taylor, and his wife, also named Sarah, who's buried in the churchyard, he became a patriot, and he joined and served in the revolution. Paul Taylor never signed the oath of loyalty to the king. He didn't actively support the loyalists. So they kind of left him alone. You were allowed to do that. But he didn't support the Patriot side either. But his son did, and he never spoke to his son again the rest of his life. And his son, Lewis, and his wife are those two stones right up against the wall there, the furthest possible point away from his father and mother that he could be and still be in the same churchyard. And they went to church together, every Sunday and didn't speak. Paul had another daughter who isn't buried here, but I just like to tell the story. She succumbed to the Methodist faith, which was spreading like wildfire. It was a little more evangelical, more progressive. It broke off from the Episcopal Church, and the Methodist Church in Connecticut was founded in Norwalk, or it's said to be, when Jesse Lee preached over in the underneath the tree that's by the little triangle at the end of Main Street. There's a weird little marker there. But she became a follower of Jesse Lee and married somebody, and her father never spoke to her again either. So not a fun family. Matthew Reed. So, the Revolution was a big pivotal point for St. Paul's. Not only did the church get burned and the rectory get burned, but it really tore the church apart, and it really tore Norwalk apart. I mean, this was a very divided town. A lot of the town was, they were loyalists. A lot of the town were patriots. So it was very split, and it was very difficult. In the end, there were about 30 families from St. Paul's alone, and there were other families who didn't go to St. Paul's that supported the King of England. But about 30 families had to leave. Their land was confiscated at the end of the war, and they lost everything, and they couldn't stay here, and they moved to Nova Scotia. So if you ever go to Halifax and you go to the cemetery, Mike and I have done, you'll see some of the same names, St. John's, Hoyt's, some of the names you see around here of people who were on the other side and they moved back to Canada. A similar story, so for people who lost property in the Revolution, the Connecticut legislature, Connecticut used to own a big swath of land all the way to Ohio, in most of Ohio. And so at the end of the Revolution, in the very late 1700s and early 1800s, they started dividing up that land, and they started awarding that to people who filed claims and said, hey, I lost my house, I lost my barn, I lost my livestock. They made a claim to the courts and the state awarded them a tract of land in Ohio. And those lands were called, and are called to this day, the Firelands. And you can go to Ohio and you'll see reference to the Firelands. But as a result of that, if you do go to Ohio, there's a Fairfield, Ohio, there's a Norwalk, Ohio. You'll see a lot of the same names. And Mike and I went to Norwalk, Ohio. There's a St. Paul's Church. I mean, there's one of everything that's here. It's kind of in miniature, smaller than Norwalk. But you walk around, they have a little graveyard around the church. It's all the same names that in the graveyards here.
Farmland was much better there, so
yeah,
they were out of here quick.
yeah. So
No rocks.
a number of families moved from here. So moving on from the colonial period, life was pretty hard in Norwalk after it was burned. It really didn't start to recover until around the 1830s, when industrialization started happening around the world, and Norwalk participated in that recovery. But things were really pretty grim from 1779 till 1820s or so. But you start to see factories being built in Norwalk. We were in a good location. We had big pottery industry, multiple pottery factories at the time, big trade going on with New York and New England. And that rise in wealth is reflected in cemeteries, whether it's Episcopalian or whether it's any other religion in the area. And just I sort of glossed over it. This was the Church of England. At the end of the Revolution, you couldn't really have Church of England in America anymore. So the ex-rector of St. Paul's, Reverend Leeming, which is a whole nother long story, but he and 5 other guys, they met up in Woodbury at the Glebe House, and they appointed Samuel Seabury to go over to England and get consecrated as a bishop so that they could establish a branch of the Church of England completely, separate from the Church of England, which became the Episcopal Church. That didn't have any reference to the king as the head of the church or anything like that. So that's how we morphed into the Episcopal Church in America.
The very first Episcopal church in America or in
Well, technically, as I was saying, this would be the first Episcopal consecrated church in America. But many of the churches in the area, they rebuilt. They became the Episcopal Church. The first Episcopal Church in Connecticut was the one in Stratford in 1705, I believe, if I can recall correctly. So anyway, moving beyond that period into the Victorian period or the industrialization period, people started to have money. The middle class started to rise. So you started to see that reflected in people's monuments in the burying ground. And white marble became really in vogue at the time. I mean, it's beautiful. Marble quarries open. They're beautiful stones. And so you see tons of white marble. That anytime you see white marble in a cemetery, that's like indicates 1820 to 1880 or so. And they look actually just like, when they're new, they look like a countertop in a kitchen. They're beautiful. I was fortunate to go to a cemetery high in the Sierra Nevadas once and go on a tour, and all the people from New England kept walking off the tour to just rub the tombstones because they were so smooth. They looked brand new, but they were from the same period. But the problem with marble is that it's very porous and very susceptible to acid rain. So you had all these factories in Norwalk polluting the air, and then all the rain coming down, and that started decimating the stones. So they looked for an alternative because granite was never used. It wasn't used till the late 1800s because you had to have powered machinery to be able to cut granite. So once powered machinery became more common, you'll start to see lots of granite tombstones and monuments. The other thing that happened, attitudes towards death really changed. In vogue in the Victorian period, as people got wealthier, you wanted to have a fabulous tombstone, not one with a skull on it, but you wanted to have a big, tall monument. And we have a lot of these tall monuments, but you'll go to Riverside, some of the other cemeteries, you'll see angels, you'll see lots of carved sculptures and all that stuff. That's reflecting a person's wealth, and so are these. People want you to know that, hey, they were a successful person in life, they were very wealthy. That means they're going to be very successful in heaven, or so they thought. So the big monuments you see, that's really what that's reflecting. Now, the other thing you'll notice at our burying ground, you see all these humps, these hills. What those are actually big tombs or mausoleums. So usually on the front or the back side, if you scrape off a few inches of dirt, there's a door, and you open the door and there's a set of stairs and you walk down and it's a room, usually with a bricked ceiling, and there's stacks of coffins. We have, I think, the most burials in one of the tombs here is actually about 25 people, and it's pretty common. And I pray that none of them ever fall open, because I've seen pictures. Happens. It will happen sooner or later, because if you think about it, they buried people in pine boxes, and then they just stacked the coffins on top of each other. Well, the oldest ones are on the bottom, so the old ones rotted first, but as soon as they rotted, and everything on top of it fell over, and there are kind of body parts everywhere. It's pretty gross. So anyway, you also see these chest tombs, this style of tomb, and that's actually, it's really interesting. There's nobody buried within the box. If you pull that back, it's just empty ground. The bodies are actually below, and depending on how much money you have, you dig a really deep hole, and you'll see on that side there's a piece of slate. If you pull that slate back, that's an opening, and there's a ladder that goes down, and they somehow, they're able to maneuver the coffins down, and they're just stacked on one on top of the other. So when you look at the top, you'll see, 5 or 6 people's names, and they're just stacked one on top of the other. So kind of interesting. All right, we'll walk around a little bit, and we'll move to the back for a few minutes, and I'll just point out some interesting people.
The mausoleums?
Which one?
Oh, the mausoleums? Which ones are the mausoleums?
So any of these ones where you see a mound,
Oh, you see a mound. Okay.
those mounds, those are actually they're big rooms underneath, and there's no, there's no connection. It's each one is individual, but they're literally rooms underground. That one right there, the Cannon Tomb, that actually has a lot of people in it as well. We have a lot of Civil War. We have a number. We probably have 20 or so Revolutionary War soldiers buried here. We have dozens of Civil War era soldiers buried here. One, you'll see, Captain Jarvis, Will Coxon. We have a whole big story about him. The Masons in town still own his sword that was actually recovered from the Union soldier, the Confederate soldier who killed him. Actually gave it back to his wife after he died when she recovered his remains. So anyway, we'll walk along here. A lot of the people, I'll just point out some of the people who are significant in the development of St. Paul's. This is the tomb of Dr. William Meade, and Dr. Meade was important. He was rector at St. Paul's for 40 years. He's the guy who built the church before this one in 1840, and then he built this building in 1849. And he was rector for 40 years. He was well loved, really built up the church. He led the effort to raise money to build a Roman Catholic church in town for all the Irish and Italian immigrants who had come. They had no place to go to church, so he led a fundraising effort among all the Protestant churches to raise money to help them have their own church. He did.
To keep them out of this church.
Well, I'm not going to look at it that way, but you can. They wanted to practice their own religion. But he actually, he rode by horseback to see his communicants, and he came in on a Thursday afternoon. He sat down in a rocking chair on the front porch of the Chittim Howe House looking at the church, and he passed away peacefully sitting on the front porch like we all do. He was succeeded by an associate, Reverend Selleck, Charles Selleck, who's this very elaborate Celtic cross here. And Selleck was an associate priest. It wasn't his full-time job. He actually ran a military academy for boys in Norwalk. But when Dr. Meade died, he took over and ran. The reason why we have a fond spot for Charles Selleck is that he wrote the definitive history of Norwalk. He wrote down, he loved history, and he wrote down a lot of the history, and then he wrote all these amazing footnotes, and the footnotes are like pages long, but he tells all these great stories in the footnotes. And so all of us who like history in Norwalk, we take a bow to Reverend Selleck pretty often. This little marker here is for Ann Kempner. Reverend William Kempner was rector at St. Paul's in the I don't know, I can't remember when, but kind of 1870, 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. Anyway, he's significant. His wife passed away when he was here, but a couple of years later, he was appointed to be the first bishop of the Northwest Territories, Wisconsin and Mission areas. So, it's kind of important to have your rector appointed to be a bishop of a new part of the country, which is pretty cool. And then over here, these very impressive tombs. This is Reverend Howell, and Reverend Howell is the guy who led the effort to build this building that we have. He was very big on the Anglo-Catholic liturgy. He wanted the chancel, he wanted the English Parish Church, and he lobbied very, very hard for it. And it was a very divisive campaign, as you can imagine, because many people were attached to the old church. And it caused a split when they decided to build this building. This is Louis Bennington Howell and his wife and his daughter. The three smaller ones, Reverend Drake he was a rector in sometime in the mid-1900s. I can't remember when, but he did a lot for the church as well. Let's move around back. We'll look at a few more, and that'll be it for the tour.
Is the Woodruff the female name?
That's her maiden name.
Her maiden name? 'Cause
Yeah.
I'm a Wood. I mean, I have Woodruff.
Well, you may be related.
And maybe you know Ralph Bloom, right?
Oh yeah,
He's my cousin.
you're a Bloom. Do you work in the
No, not in the I'm an
family
artist.
business? Good for
I'm
you.
the outcast artist person. But I found Woodruffs in Union, and I found the Goodwins who married into the Blooms in that Norwalk East Norwalk
Yep.
historical one.
Yep.
A Goodwin, a nice white one there. So white. They must have poured something over. The whitest one. in the whole-
Well, you can clean them. I clean these every so
Yeah.
often with
They do.
ammonia, an ammonia-based product. Yeah,
Another one. Thank you.
sure. So I just want to quickly show you this. I don't actually know anything about Lorinda. Sorry, Lorinda. But I just think this is one of the prettiest tombstones in our cemetery. This is remember I told you there were three designs: the angel with wings, the skull with wings, the angel with wings. The last evolution, before kind of everybody started doing whatever they wanted, was this willow tree and an urn. And the urn was a Roman symbol for, death, memorialization. The willow tree is a symbol in Christianity for, resurrection, life renewing, because you can just take a branch of a willow, stick it in the ground, it turns into a tree. So this was a really popular design at the end of the colonial period. This is pretty late. I mean, she died in 1846. You don't really see this design really much after the 1830s. But I just wanted to point that out. And you'll see it on some of the other white marble stones in here. We'll just look at a couple more. It could just be, the particular stone that they carved. I mean, we do clean these every few years. We spray cleaner on it, and some clean up better than others, and I kind of need to come back and do another round. I just want to point out, this is Jacob Jennings. He was a Revolutionary War soldier. He was also a silversmith in town. If you go to the Norwalk Historical Society Museum, you can see a little spoon that he made that we still have. And there's a whole lot of stories about him, but he was a really interesting person. I wanted to point out, this is made of brownstone from the Connecticut River Valley. And that was the other popular material in the colonial period, besides slate, was brownstone. The problem with brownstone, of course, is that it's sedimentary rock, it's mud, and it just tends to fall apart. And you'll see many of the brownstones just won't last. But it's the same material as you'll see in Brooklyn and some parts of Manhattan, but all from the Connecticut River Valley. We'll look at two more. So I just like to point Stephen Hoyt's tombstone out. He has the rare distinction that he served in both the Revolution and the War of 1812. He didn't really do much in the War of 1812 because it's very short, but he did muster and come out to serve, so he gets credit. So you just don't see that many people who were able to serve in both wars. Our final stop is you'll see that's another rendition of the willow and urn design, that round one right there. That's actually more common than Lorinda's. But I want to stop at my favorite, my friend Alvin Mitrash. Alvin was an African American, a freed African American slave. We don't know a whole lot about him, but we do know that he was the beloved sexton of the church. He took care of the property and he was well thought of. His wife was named Jenny. I think she's somewhere here. Actually, that's the son of, this is Alvin, sorry. His wife Jenny, I think she's actually right there. Her stone is missing. But she actually ran she sold cakes and soda water out of her house over off Moody's Lane right by the river. And there's an account, Selleck wrote about how young people for a date, they would go over to Jenny Mitrash and they would have soda and cake, which is how we know that. Alvin's tombstone is a white marble. He died in 1829 at the age of 67 years. I originally thought, well, he must have been in the Navy or he captained a boat or something like that. But when I started studying the symbols people used on tombstones, an anchor represents, basically an anchor, steadfastness or faithfulness. And he was given this because he was, faithful to the church and he was so well thought of. And this is actually, even though it's in the back of the churchyard, this is a very prominent spot for somebody to be buried because it's very, very close to the high altar. You really can't get closer than this. And that's considered really the best space. It's like you want to be at the front door where Ralph Isaacs is, or you want to be here. But the interesting thing about Alvin, back in the early 1800s and really through the 1800s, they passed a law in federal Congress to appease the Southerners that allowed people to come up and claim their slaves who escaped. And so it was a common practice for slave traders to come up here and accuse someone of being an escaped slave and then take them back. Did you ever see the movie 12 Years a Slave that came out, 10 years or so ago? Was kind of a similar story, but with a better ending. So the same thing happened to Alvin. A slave trader from the South came up, accused him of being an escaped slave. Church members rallied around him, gave testimony, wrote letters to the court, and said, no, we have known him forever. He has been here. And the judge said, yeah, no, you can't take him. He's a free guy. A pretty good story, I think, overall for St. Paul's. Not to say that there's not a lot of other less good stories about St. Paul's. We have a research group going on right now. Every rector from the founding of St. Paul's, at least through the Revolution, each owned at least one slave. And many of the families buried here, they owned slaves. One slave is bad. It wasn't the same as the South. You didn't have big plantations and things like that with, thousands of people, but they were slaves nonetheless, and I'm sure many treated badly. And so St. Paul's, we're researching our involvement in both slavery, racism, and prejudice this year, and we'll be publishing that later just to recognize and understand our history and past. And we'll probably be doing some kind of event later in the year where we'll present all that, and you're certainly all welcome to come. It's all very interesting stuff to learn about our past. It's pretty much what I have. Did I miss anything, Mike, I could mention?
Just that when the labyrinth was built 20 years ago here, David gave assurance that it was in a spot where there were no graves because the northwest corner of the church was never used for burials. Can you explain why? Because I don't remember why.
So all things, if you lived in England, all things bad came from the northwest. Cold winds and Vikings. So that was considered not good ground. It was, you know, it was kind of jinxed ground. So they never buried anybody on the northwest side of the church.
Just empty land
So we
there. and
we
didn't
put
know
the
why.
labyrinth there to kind of make it a sacred space and get rid of all the hoaxes and stuff on it. So, yes, John.
Doing a very, very random and tiny sampling, I see many wives buried here who are aged 35, 36. I'm guessing these are women that might have died of childbirth. And I'm wondering if there's any records or statistics that capture that death.
We should do that. I haven't done that. I did look at plagues that went through. There's like 4 tombstones directly across from the Chittim Hill House, right at the edge of the parking lot, of children of one family that died of smallpox, all within a year. 4 kids. I mean, isn't awful. But there's a couple of boys that were drowned together. There's some really sad stories. But yeah, you see lots of men with multiple wives, and I'm sure it was largely due to childbirth issues.
What's the botanical reference? Remember we had an actor here and it was some
So-
connection to something big.
Well, yeah. So, as I mentioned, there are a lot of unmarked graves. We know that a guy named Ashton Blackburn is buried here, and he died in 1780 or so. He was an Englishman, but he was the 3rd son of an earl. And if you're the 3rd son of an earl, you're pretty much, you know, screwed. You're getting nothing. You know, if you're the 1st son, you win. You're the 2nd son, you stay around in case the 1st son dies, because then you win. The 3rd son really never gets anything. So he was very close to his sister, who also doesn't get anything. But she stayed in England at the family estate, as was often done. And he moved here and was very interested. They were both interested. They were naturalists. They were interested in flora and fauna. And he was very interested, particularly in birds, not just birds, but documenting bird life. And so he would send preserved birds and drawings of birds over to his sister, who was in contact with Carl Linnaeus in Sweden, who developed the nomenclature for naming everything we have, plants and animals. So there's the Blackburnian warbler, a Native American bird that is named after Ashton Blackburn, and there's a couple of other insects named after Ashton. He passed away during the Revolution. He was also, it's recorded, John Adams used to stop in Norwalk on his way to New York, which was the head of, you know, the government at the time, to visit with Ashton, because he was a big naturalist, and he started the Boston Museum of Natural History, President Adams. So he was big friends with Ashton Blackburn, so he used to come and visit him. But because he died in the middle of a war with England, his sister, his family couldn't do anything about it, and there was never a stone. And we know that he's buried here, we just don't know where. But you know, another kind of weird random story that's fascinating and there's many more. So
The Blackburnian warbler
The black-
stops, pays a visit.
yeah. So anyway, any other questions?
Where was Alvin slave? Was he a slave in Connecticut?
We don't know. We know that he was a freed slave, but we don't know from where or from whom. I mean, probably from around here. People didn't really move around much. We don't believe he was an escaped slave from the South. There was a lot more freed slaves in the Northeast, because there were a lot more people of conscience even back then in the Northeast. There was an anti-abolition movement in the Northeast for many, many years. It was small, but it wasn't prevalent. The mindset of slavery wasn't prevalent like it was in the South. So. Yes, sir.
Just a question about the symbolism in the stones, because it's so important. This is what's left with posterity. And you're mentioning that the stones with skull and then the willows and now the anchors. But I think there is another embedded symbol in most of the, especially the old stones. And that's the corners of the stones, they to me they represent the wings of angels. And those shaped stones are actually kind of the guardian angels, the remaining guardian angels.
Yep.
And this is a very enduring motifs with staying power.
Yep, you're right. You're absolutely right. There are whole books on symbolisms and symbols of tombstones, and it just goes on and on and on. People use, if you see a column, like a Roman column, you'll see those cut off and maybe a flag over it. That means that's a young person, life cut short, usually somebody who died in a war, but that's almost always somebody who's young, where their life is cut short. There's just, meaning in everything.
And the carvers were in big cities, so when someone died, they would write to Boston or Philadelphia or one of the other big colonial cities, like New York, I guess. But I think most of ours came from Boston, didn't they?
The early stones, we didn't have a carver in Norwalk until around 1820 or so. So all of the tombstones from the 1700s were either from Newport or Charlestown, Boston. And we know who the carvers were. I mean, I could have gone into that. There's a lot of documentation on colonial era carvers. And you can tell, you can learn just by, you look in a book and you're like, oh yeah, this is how he made the smile on the skull or the teeth, or you can tell exactly who the carver was. So, which is fascinating because you can then establish what the trading patterns were between the colonies. And when most of it was done by ship at the time. But we had a big trading pattern with Newport. Most of the slate, I think all of our slates came from Newport. A lot of the brownstones were carved in Charlestown, Massachusetts. A few of the slates too, but most of that.
And can you mention the stones in the church basement on the Yale Green? The New Haven Green?
So if you're ever in New Haven and they're actually open, the center, you know how there's 3 churches on the New Haven Green? So interesting about the New Haven Green, that was their town burying ground. There's like 25,000 people buried on the New Haven Green where people are picnicking and throwing the Frisbee. And it's a very poltergeist kind of story. And the first design cemetery, see, I can go on and on and on, in pretty much the world is actually the New Haven Cemetery. I forgot the name. The Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven. It was the first design cemetery where they laid out plots and they buried people. If you look around the walls of the Grove Street Cemetery, you see all of the tombstones they took from the green, they lined around the walls, but they didn't move the bodies. And so occasionally when they're doing construction or they have a big rain and a femur comes up, whatever. But what's really interesting, as Mike pointed out, the center church is open. I think it's usually Saturday mornings. You can go down into the basement. When they made the decision to build Grove Street Cemetery about the time the center church was built, and they got agreement with the center church that they would build the basement over the part of the cemetery and not touch the stones. So if you go into the basement, there are all these brownstone and slate stones that look brand new because they were never exposed to acid rain. And it's really amazing. They look like they're brand new. And it's if you're into tombstones, it's one of the coolest things you'll see because they're like brand new. Napoleon sent his engineers over to look at the Grove Street Cemetery because they were having a problem. The churchyards were stuffed full and they were unsanitary and they were getting plagues and all this stuff. And he sent his engineers over to look at how they designed Grove Street Cemetery. And they used that as the basis to design Père Lachaise Cemetery, the very beautiful cemetery outside of Paris. And then subsequently from that, the one in Cambridge, can't remember the name, was built, which is also a very beautiful cemetery. Mount Auburn, yeah. So anyway, I could go on and on and on. But anyway, thank you for your attention.
One fun fact, sorry.
Go ahead.
1737, when this church was founded, George Washington was 5 years old. That just gives you a reference of how early. Anyway.
I just love throwing realize how old that is. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.